So we'll start with Chris. If you could just introduce yourself and some words, and then once you finish, Sophie, if you could come down the line, and we can start from there. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I've spoken to a few people here today already. So my name's Chris Greenway. I'm the Director of Internal Audit at the Co-operative Bank, based up in Manchester. I've worked in financial services audit for the last 20 years or so with a variety of organisations across the UK, mostly in banking and other bits and bobs around financial services. Combined assurance has been a bit of a holy grail through a number of the organisations I've worked for, and I still haven't seen it done perfectly, so I'm as interested in some of the conversation today as hopefully you are. And I'm particularly interested in how we stop it just becoming a cost play between first and second line.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Sophie.
So Sophie Dupré-Cheveria, I'm the Chief Risk Officer at Gulf International. We're both a bank and an asset manager, even though we're still a small organisation in the UK. And like I guess everyone on this panel, I've also have worked in financial services for a long time, almost 20 years as well. But interestingly, I had experience across the three lines of defense, so I've lived how it feels from the first line of defense perspective. The second line is where I spent most of my time, but also had a brief stint in the third line of defense. So I've seen a little bit of the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of collaborations or not for that purpose. Yeah.
Perfect.
My name is Chandra, and I'm a chartered accountant. I've been working in audit for over 2 decades now, and have worked in 4 other banks before: ING, UBS, RBS, Goldman's, and Deutsche. And I've also, similar to Sophie, was in the first line for a relatively short period of time. And financial services is all I know, and we are going to talk about leveraging the 3 lines of defense. I'm excited to share my thoughts about those.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Ivan Martinez. I'm now the Chief Auditor in the Santander London branch business. I have more than 15 years in audit, almost 17 in financial services. So I spent 14 years in Santander. Previous to this, I was in some small banks in Spain, in wealth management, first line as well. So I think the same as all of us, I'm here to give my impressions about how to link the 3 lines of defense and to hear your comments as well.
Thank you. So you can tell from the experience sat next to me, I was totting it up. There's over, let's say, 80 plus years of experience here around internal audit and risk. Before we kick on, can I just get a raise of hands of how many are actively in the audit function in the room? Brilliant. So half the room. So if half the room can go that way and the other half can go that way, then we can sort of have a run. And the other side of the room, anyone running risk as their main objective here? Okay. Yes, okay. So the room is completely divided in half around audit and risk, which is actually exactly what you want to see in today's world. So we've got some predefined questions that the panelists have had a look at and are happy to come and discuss. And also in these types of events, it's really important to make it an interactive. So if you don't agree, let them know, and we can have a bit of fun. I'm joking, Chris. We're starting with you. So the question that I've put to the panel, we'll start with Chris, and then we'll move down the line, if that's okay. Chris, what are the preconditions to effectively linking up all lines of defence? Do you want to just start with the context of that question, on where it comes from, and then answer if that's okay?
Yes, I can do.
Thank you.
So this is one of the challenges in a number of organisations where we've talked about combined assurance and working more closely with 3 lines of defence. And the starting point is the appetite of the business. And so the context is really in organisations where there isn't the appetite for combined assurance and there isn't the vision to see the benefits, it doesn't happen because it takes significant challenge, investment and to some extent cost from senior management before the benefits start to come through. So for me, the biggest precondition is hearts and minds around appetite. And then on top of that, I think that the two others that I'd really call out are around consistency, not absolute consistency of approach across the three lines, but a working towards a common language, a common understanding, a belief in the risk framework that it sits on. So consistency across three lines and openness and transparency across three lines as well. So a clear willingness to share, a clear belief and support of the process they're going through, but also an absence of point scoring or individual value rather than seeing the collective benefit for delivering an effective process.
Can I just interject before we jump down?
Yes.
Appetite. So if they don't, if your business or organisation doesn't have the appetite,
then I think you can make some progress, but you can't be successful.
right. Okay.
That's my limited experience. There may be better examples,
No,
but
sure.
I don't mind. You have to win the hearts and minds because, and you see it clearly, as with anything you try to do across three lines or in an organisation, there was a level of cynicism where people have seen it tried before and seen it not work before, and people will always go to that first in terms of, I've seen that before and it took a lot of effort, it didn't deliver any value, what are you going to do differently? And so it's getting over that with senior stakeholders in the first instance.
Thank you. Sophie?
Well, we went quite deep quite quickly, but I would say first prerequisite is to have three lines of defense, and that may sound obvious, but some organizations still don't. And also I would say three lines of defense maybe were internal, because I think it would be quite hard to put that in practice. For example, if you still rely to your external auditors for the third line. But that said, yes, I agree with those 3 points. So it's about communication, and what you require to communicate. You require a common language, you require the willingness to communicate, and you require the time to communicate. So on the language, similarly, I would say having a single taxonomy is very important. A single risk assessment matrix is really important, because otherwise you're going to confuse everyone, right? It's just not going to work. In terms of the willingness, is sometimes just boiled down to rapport at the top, which then cascade down, and in small organization it's maybe a handful of people, and it just depends if they get on, frankly. And the third aspect is time. So time obviously depends on how much a priority it is for people to make that work, and again that comes from the buy-in at the top. And also, I would argue, it depends on incentives. So people often forget that, without actually giving people the right objectives or the right way to measure success, it's really hard, even if you have the willingness to then spend the time, creating those links, if you're not going to be rewarded for it.
Yeah. I think it gets harder as we go down the panel, because I can see you're thinking, what am I going to say about this? Brilliant, two brilliant comments there. Good luck.
I think building on what Chris and Sophie said, in terms of having the single risk taxonomy, I think if we take a step back, when you mention having three lines of defense, I think it's equally, important to have the right attitude. I think I've seen in 5 banks, the ORM function, the compliance function, the first line function, and 1.5. I think we'll come on to that later, the 1.5 line of defense function, and of course audit, all behaving differently, maybe because of different agenda, maybe because of different drivers, and not working together. I think that sums it up. I think working together is very, very important. Do we have the right attitude? Can we work with each other and try and work for the organization? Because more often than not, I sit in audit, but I tell that very clearly to our stakeholders that we work for the same bank or the same organization. So similarly, all the risk functions work for the same organization, and our job is to collectively get the business in a better shape. And I think the second, third, 1.5 line, whichever you want to call it, they have a critical role in being a better critical friend to the business. And I think that is lost in translation sometimes. At the tone at the top, someone needs to reinforce that. Someone needs to send that message across. And I think working together as a panel, coming together as a common group, and meeting often, building the rapport and the relationship, the understanding and trust is paramount to getting them to work together towards the organization's goals and objectives. I think the attitude matters a lot. And coming back to the risk methodology, common methodology is very important, and I think there we should let the egos go away and look at the common taxonomy, common risk hierarchy, common risk assessment framework, the impact, the likelihood, if we go down the common set of risks, common definitions, and what it means to the business very clearly. When we say it's let's say, a major risk, what does that mean? Have we defined that commonly and agreed it? I think those kind of things get to when we talk of the nuts and bolts, I think that is where the crux lies. In the testing methodology, again, when we say we test a key control, when has it passed? Or compliance has passed it, but audit says that's not good enough. That just doesn't work. I think it all goes back to the attitude and the willingness to work together to build a common framework, and and then put that, implement that basically across.
Not much to say here. So I think, and coming back a little bit to Chris' point, one of the main things is about the appetite of the organization to spend money, because all of these points on putting in common aspects cost money usually, because in the past, the three lines of defense, we usually work on different taxonomies, different definition of risk, different even definition of businesses or issues. So when you speak different languages, it's very difficult to be aligned and to have a proper aligned strategy of where we want to go, what we want to achieve, and this is key on helping on this. I think, just to add some minor thing, it's important to have an appropriate governance as well, because sometimes it's difficult. We are slow in all of meetings and our BAU, and sometimes we don't have the proper governance in place to ensure that we break the silos. That is key to link all of the three lines. Because, again, just to be a little bit repetitive on this, but we've got different appetites, we've got different incentives, we look to the same animal from different angles, and our goals are sometimes different, so we need this kind of governance to ensure that we are all aligned and we have a common forum to discuss all these aspects, and especially to build our annual plan and align all our programs to ensure that we are not duplicating and being redundant in some of the areas.
Well done. So, interesting, when you ask a question like that, and the question again was what were the preconditions to effectively linking up all lines of defence? Actually, the words that I wrote down, I'll share back to you. And it was interesting because I was always taught that when people are talking about, the best way to look at answering a question, they bring out words that actually might have stories in the past. So, Chris, the word I put to you is appetite. Yeah. Which would indicate that maybe in the past life, appetite was the problem that internal audit would face, right? Not you personally, but appetite was the challenge. Sophie, language, taxonomy, common language across the business to ensure that the data is there to be able to report on. I wrote down team. we're actually part of the same team, which is really interesting because I had LinkedIn to say, why would you say that? Not you personally, but why would team be so important? Because we're all part of the same team in a business. Is it because maybe the appetite of the company wasn't aligned? There was no common language across the business, so therefore internal audit seemed to be not part of the business team. And then Ivan came out with a brilliant one. Would anyone like to guess what I wrote down for Ivan? Money. Right. And governance, which, by the way, was quite amusing because that came second. But money, right? So now we have the appetite of the 3 lines of defence with the taxonomy and the language, which meant the team becoming part of a trusted advisor into internal audit, and then the money to fund it. Which actually is probably quite a good summary to answer that first point. Would anyone want to add an extra word to that? You are welcome. I can't get the mic to you, but you can shout if that's okay.
So I'm Pascal, I'm with Impact Systems, but I'd like to...
Thank you.
Oh, that was deeper.
I'm an advisor to the board of the Swiss Risk Association, and I am much aware of the fact that the regulator considers 3 lines of defense as being smart practice today. The US regulator even imposes the wording. So business risk management now needs to be called first line of defense. Yet I can tell you that in Switzerland there's a consensus amongst the major financial institutions that the 3 lines of defense de facto bears a lot of inefficiencies and fatigue. And that there are other models, and one I would like to share with you is the one of airports. Because the safest airports in the world are those where your identity is checked just once. So you are being identified just once, not 3 times. And so how would it look like, and this is a question that we are asking ourselves, how could that transpose into financial services the fact that there is one control, potentially being human enhanced with technology, for instance, or maybe with a second line of defense being audit, or whatever, we don't have the solution, but 3 lines of defense is not necessarily the panacea.
What a brilliant comment. Where's the airport?
It's based on an Israeli model.
Oh, okay. Not Luton then? No. So, not Heathrow either. No, perfect. So therefore, so that actually links beautifully onto the next question, in my opinion. So do you want to tackle that for a starter point, and then we'll come into the second question? Yeah.
So firstly, I would say your comment on make a checker, I think, is on checking things once is more effective than checking things more than once. I feel is very relevant, and I've seen and observed that many times in my career, that when something bad happens, a mistake is made, people react by saying, let's add another check, but actually it just dilutes the responsibility and the focus, and I feel that it's actually counter-effective. So it's counterintuitive, but really I'm also a strong believer of not multiplying and duplicating checks. And therefore, that's why I think the key for having an effective 3 lines of defense model is not to duplicate the checks, it's not to duplicate the same activities. And I strongly believe that, therefore, the 3 lines of defense should have very clear roles and responsibility, which are not the same. And for example, the second line, should design the risk framework. You shouldn't let that to internal audit, and internal audit should use that risk framework, right? But equally, I would argue that the first line of defense is not very well placed to design the framework, but is much better placed to actually implement it. So that, I would say, is very important. And you're right, it does link very well to our second point, which is, so what's happening with this 1A line of defense? And first of all, what do I call, or do we call the 1A line of defense? I have observed that since the latest financial crisis in 2008, pressure has built on organizations in the financial services to enhance their risk management practices and to increase their risk resources. And that has put a lot of pressure on people in the front office who were maybe not very used to conduct some formal risk management practices. There may be managed risk, but not in a formal way. And sometimes companies or firms have reacted in this therefore friction by saying, okay, this is not your core activity, you're still here to make money, and therefore, let's deviate that and focus all of this, second line or third line questions or activities or pressure onto those specific individuals. And therefore, at the end, we saw some full dedicated risk team being built in the first line of defense. And overall, I was trying to get, I was searching my memories and I think, did I see anything good coming out of that? And I was able to remind myself that on the surface, sometimes it did ease communication, because you have a new project, there is something new to implement, or there is just something to deliver. It's nice and easy to be able to go to that dedicated team or that dedicated person in the first line to get it done. But overall, I feel that it's been quite detrimental, because one, to your point, it's kind of blurred the line as to who's responsible for what. Second, and actually I've worked in UBS recently, so I've heard the Swiss perspective on this. Second, there is a huge pressure about where is the cost, where's the cost going to be borne? If you have your first line of defense dedicated risk team, then the business doesn't want investment into the second and third line anymore, and that creates a lot of animosity and a lot of conflict. And thirdly, the obvious one, the most obvious one to me is, have you really embedded risk management practices in the first line of defense once you've actually created dedicated teams that are separate to the people who actually make the transaction or talk to the client? Because all you wanted to do is change the mindset of the people who actually take the risk, but what you've done is you just added some colleagues to handle that on their behalf or for them, so you've actually achieved just the opposite. So unfortunately, I'm not really presenting a balanced case. I don't think it's a good experiment, in my view.
Okay. Just to recap on that question that we brilliantly segued into, and thank you for reading the question beforehand. No, I'm joking. Is that some organisations have a dedicated 1A line of defence between first and second line of business. Do we think this has helped collaborate or hinder the relationship with the three lines of defence? So I'm going to be fair, and Chris, you're going to have to get ready at the end of this one. Do you want to take your points on that, please? Thanks.
Yes, I think this is creating a lot of debate in the industry about. I think you pointed the real problem of this is about roles and responsibilities. This is the key part. I mean, from my opinion, what we cannot do is just to put all the burden on this line and say, these guys are the new risk, the new compliance, and we don't need second line anymore, and the second line are going to be a mere checkers. First line A is doing everything. I think we need to be very careful on this, and because at the end of the day they are first line. That is the final perception, at least from internal audit perspective. And it's true that they can add value by doing and one of the points that Sophie also pointed is about changing the first line mindset about controls. So that should be very linked to the business, because the businessmen, they need to understand that they need to to comply with the external regulation, they need to embed into their BAU activities several controls, but we should be very careful about isolating this thing from the business and just creating another couple of layers and just doing the same things that second line were doing. It's like, should be a combination, they should be like a translator between second and first line, but it should never take the second line function. For instance, in my organization, the typical things that this line performs are some tough stuff like business reporting, regulatory reporting, these kind of things that in the past were performed by second line and now is embedded into first line, but with the supervision of the second line, and they are working very close with second line.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I think I can sit here and give you all the stats of how this 1.5 line of defense came into being, which bank has how many people, but I have seen in real life examples of where some real life examples where it has worked well and some examples where it hasn't worked so well. So I think in balance, as Sophie said, it's a little bit of a hit and miss. I think where they implemented this or they brought this division in, saying we need it as an emergency measure, saying we need to do a lot of things quite fast, and there it has worked very well. And after that, when the control environment got back into management's appetite, they've scaled the function down. That is a good example. And equally, for instance, in let's say in Barclays and Citi, where they built a 4-digit army, mirroring audit and compliance, so to speak. It's added on a layer. I think to your point, brilliantly, it adds to audit fatigue. There's the regulator, there's compliance, there's 1.5 line of defense, there's internal audit who are regulatory mandated to do stuff, and there's the regulator themselves, and ORM, of course, not to forget them. So there are typically 6 people looking after the same answer. So how do we try and leverage that? I don't think I've seen a good example, but to going back to what Ivan said earlier, I think where we share the plans and where we share and make sure. I think in Credit Suisse they implemented something called as a traffic light system. So now it is red, that means someone is here, don't go in, and when it is green, then go in. Something like that they introduced, at least for the key areas which were being repeatedly hit, and that worked. But as I said, I think in some cases it worked really well where they introduced the 1.5, but in most cases, or in other cases, you can see a bit touch and go, because they have their own agenda, and then they are a group of risk professionals sitting on top of business. Wherever you go, I mean, the definition of the regulators is quite clear. I think last year in a similar event where the FCA and the PRA were present, I openly said that as an industry we need to lobby to make sure that we, as in auditors or second line, can rely on what the first line has done if they have done it to a good level of detail. And there wasn't any pushback, but I think we are not there yet, because the US regulators push you down a particular route. The European and the UK regulators say, we kind of expect this, so they guide you in a particular route. So the 3 lines is very prevalent. I've also sat in where there was this discussion about the 4th line of defense, which is your capital. So you can take it you can expand it as much as you want, but I think the long and short of it is, if you introduce the 1.5 line as a critical measure, as an ICU, intensive care unit kind of measure, and you scale it down once you've got it in your appetite, I think I've seen those functions work. But we should never confuse that 1.5 line, or whatever you want to call it, 1A, is still the business. So the first line is the business, and they own it.
Brilliant. I'm just going to sum up, Chris, before you come in. No. No, but sometimes no. Where are you, Chris?
So clearly no.
Ah, no, okay, brilliant.
But,
Were you
however,
Ah.
so the important thing for me, in addition to all the points in the raised, is understanding the motivations for why it's been set up. And there were two that I've seen on a number of occasions that drive the setting up of 1A. The first is to protect senior management from surprise adverse opinions that may impact their bonuses. And secondly, to supplement a lack of skills around risk management within senior management in the first line. And it's the idea of a risk centre of excellence to come into almost to act as a crutch for the organisation, which again in the short-term measure works as long as there's a transfer of skills. And I think you need to address the root causes if you're going to stop it, because it's like whack-a-mole. If you stop them building their line 1A over here, it'll pop up over here. If you centralise more of the risk oversight into the second line, the first line will build up a 1A, because you're not dealing with the underlying root cause. So you've got to align your incentive programmes, and you have to make sure the skills are there in the first line.
Whack-a-mole, for people that don't know, is where a mole comes up and you hit it on the head. Good reference in audit, I like that, Chris. That might actually be my second favourite expression of the day. My first, obviously, was what did Paddy say? Paddy McGinnis, he called it a blame storming. So instead of brainstorming, he said blame storming. So whack-a-mole, blame storming are the two words I'm taking from this conference. Summit. Can I carry on a little point on that, Chris? Education came up as the word that you picked there. Not suggesting that the boards need to be educated around the importance of due diligence, governance and internal audit. What about the future generations coming through behind you? I'm going a little bit off piece, but you did call out education there. What do you think the industry can do, and I suppose into the room here as well, of actually attracting the future generation of you guys, right, to be able to handle that at the board level in 10 to 15 years' time? The guys coming out of university and schools right now are our future leaders. Everything that you're talking about is the evolving of internal audit. Education, Chris.
So for me, it's an important one. So we bring graduates into our team, and the first thing we do with them is we send them out into the business. So they do placements in the first and second line as it exists within our organisation to help us in the third line, understand how the business is operating, but also because ultimately, if we build a good risk professional, they should be able to use anywhere across the organisation. So from my perspective, it's about growing your own and taking people from the organisation and growing the skills on them via rotations, but bringing fresh graduates in and instilling good practices, professional qualifications, but broad exposure. I think a stronger auditor is an auditor that's spent time across the lines of defence.
And what's the job title that you're bringing them in under?
Internal audit trainee.
Right. Yeah.
For me.
Yeah. No, for sure. Do you want to have a go at that off-the-cuff question?
It's a very good question, I must say. So
Thanks.
what we try and do, we call we call them smart auditors. What do I mean by smart auditors? We basically are a mixture, or they basically are a mixture of core operational knowledge and your technology, which is your applications, the front to back flow, etc. They understand that. And of course data analytics, without which you can't do much. So I think in the future, all these three skills that I mentioned are going to be equally important, and I think I would argue technology and data analytics a little bit more. Even me, a dinosaur, I'm trying to learn Python because at the end of the day I need to survive, and the tsunami of data analytics and big data and technology innovations is going to hit us very soon. I think even when I talk to the audit committee and the board, I say that in the senior manager regime, you need to look at the mix of skill set, and you need to basically do a fundamental rethink of don't see who is in the position, see who should be in the position, and tailor your needs accordingly. So I have tailored the Smart Auditor program to recruit people with that kind of finesse, with that kind of flair for attention to detail, but also trying to be innovative in learning more about the business and helping them, rather than coming and pointing a finger, which in a nutshell is the current practice, which I don't like. There's always the debate between them and us. That should never be the case. It is us together. I think the smart auditors realize that, and that is something I'm very proud of for the future.
I'm going to go off piste a little bit. I apologise. I just think this conversation is really interesting. I hope you all agree. No one's left, so that's good. So we talk about education. We talk about it makes total sense to bring in graduates, put them into the business, understand the business, understand the business, understand the business. You're looking at the profile of someone that is analytical, that can communicate and collaborate. So, Sophie, this is really unfair. Do you, therefore, if you think risk-based approach is the future today and tomorrow, and there's been sessions on agile auditing and analytics and AI, do you think the future CEO is going to be someone from the risk background or the internal audit background? Can you ever see that? Because you are creating very well understood graduates in the firms that understand the processes, they understand the risks, they understand the business. Is this a time for internal audit or risk to be the CEO of the firms now? Or is it too risky?
Well, I think that in smaller firms, given that the size of the leadership team is much smaller by definition, there's already a lot more integration of the CRO or the chief auditor into the management, the question that the leadership team is facing around the business objective, the strategy, the culture, and everything. So at least they are more part of the conversation. But it's true that I've never met so far a CEO who actually came from one of those, as being a practitioner in risk or audit. But I've seen people who had an experience elsewhere, and what I was going to add to both your comments is yes, if we stop recruiting people for what they've done before and put them in the same box again, and instead recognize that each of your experience brings some skills that are transferable and usable in a new role, then people will have had more of a rounded experience and will be your ideal candidate for the leader of the organization. But it's still a stretch of my imagination, at least, to think of a CEO would have had spent most of their career in audit on risk, but I think a CEO would be much stronger if they had spent some of their careers in those functions.
So the evolution could be there. Are you the next CEO?
In fact, in Santander, we've got these examples. For instance, the CEO in the Santander UK business had a lot of background in internal audit and financial controller.
Right.
So I think from the experience it gives them a lot of, let's say, experience in all the areas, because in my opinion, from being a chief internal auditor, it gives you a complete view of the whole organization, and it's something that is very difficult to see in the business areas, because in general they are very focused on their business, on their profit, on their, going back to Chris' comments, on their bonuses, so they don't see the whole picture. So when some of them, they go from there to becoming a CEO, they struggle a lot to have a picture about the supporting functions, control functions, and it's difficult for them to understand what these guys are adding to the whole organization. Where when you come from this position, you see the whole picture, you see all the interaction between all the areas, and you see how every single area is necessary to the proper performance. And coming back to the education, I think the next challenge is going to be having a CEO with an IT background and I think it's coming because, and coming back to the program, we've got in Santander a program that is called Leaders of the Future, that we are identifying trainees and very mid-management people with a high background in digital aspects to face the next big bang in the industry if we are not already there. So I think the next point is going to be having a CEO with a high background in IT and probably in audit. I don't see it, but that's it.
Chandra, you talked about being a dinosaur, my word.
To answer your question, there are two real-life examples where chief audit execs have become the CEOs. Mary McNiff, who was the chief audit exec for Citi, went on to take a role as CEO of Americas for Citigroup. There's one more candidate within my firm, my boss currently, who's transitioning into a role, I think, let's keep this private, as the CEO for Italy, another country, and they both are career auditors. I think Goldman's has this very good rotational program wherein the PMDs, the partner MDs that they promote, have to do a rotation into audit because there, as to your point, they get the full picture. I am of the view that CEOs need to be revenue minded, so they need to have a certain mindset and they need to drive the company forward in that direction. However, it does help them a lot if they balance that a little bit with the control angle, which they will get when they look at the front to back view when they are in audit. I think the various businesses do various things, but to answer your question, yes, I could be.
Brilliant. Chris?
No, and I think it's fair to say that the change is going to be that the skill set to be an effective chief internal auditor is changing to be more aligned to the skill set to be the chief exec, rather than recognition that these core audit skills that we've all got are the ones that some of the organisation needs. I think Mary's a great example of that, who has always been entrepreneurial in the way that she runs an audit function, and it takes that into leading the organisation.
A driver, an expressive type personality as opposed to deeply analytical.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Yeah, perfect. Sorry, guys. I just love that point. So we've jumped off a question, but I was going to open it up to the team. Can I have some microphone help? Is that all right? So, guys, we've got about 5 minutes. You can ask them any question; they'll answer it as much as you can. And there's one behind. If you could just introduce yourself and then ask the question.
Sure. Jury Cheka, also EPAM system, Switzerland, Zurich. I have probably one comment and probably the question. One is based on, we've talked about what should be the auditor. I worked for headquarters of ISACA, we have 140,000 certified professionals 5 years ago, and on strategic study S20, and we have defined so what should be a role of ITVP, information trust value professional. And basically after half a year we agreed that there are mostly the intrinsic value, capability to communicate, build relations, etc. So I think that might be even more valuable for the future. The other point, what I am not sure is, well, in the morning we heard from Mr. Barry McGuinness that basically 80% of malware and security issue were not covered because they were new. And audit is very often looking at situation now. And I wonder, concretely with respect to the cyber, I mean, it's pretty much difficult, I think, from auditing point of view to take up the static standards. We have NIST, the National Industry Standard Technology. We have some standards from the banking. But I think, let's say in finance, it's probably the only way where to look at the future in auditing is the business continuity management. So I wonder whether something like that shouldn't be worse to define for the security issues. Because basically the auditor must have a look at the future, not expectable risk, and this is, I think, pretty much difficult to standardize. So I'd like to see hear your opinion about it.
Great. Thank you. It's interesting, isn't it? Because unfortunately, the market of financial services has been the focus of robbery ever since banks were invented way back in the Wild West, right? And I can't imagine an auditor stood at the front door checking the locks. But that's pretty much where we sit now, isn't it? In cyber security, especially, they're not coming through the front door anymore. They're coming through phishing, etc. Who would like to have a go at looking into the future and telling us what's about to come out? And if you do know, we suggest that you keep it to yourself, and then you can make some money on it. Who would like to start that one?
Maybe I can pick up.
Yeah.
I'll take a stab at it and then we get on with it. I think to your point, it's absolutely right. And it's one of my bugbear that we always try and do a post-mortem, whereas we should actually always be looking into the future. And I think cyber security is a key skill set that many audit functions lack. I know how difficult it is to recruit those kind of skill sets, and I know how difficult it is to look into the crystal ball. But if you look at the recent guidelines or studies on boards, be it or if you look at the FRC and the guidance they've issued to the boards, I think they've all asked for a forward-looking risk committee similar to the board. I mean, there is a board, but you should also have a risk committee similar to the audit committee, which is looking at the future. And I think audit has a big role to play in it, because we talk to our peers, we talk to the regulators, we are always trying to be on top of what the regulators are looking at. We are also trying to see where the business is, and compared to everyone else, we can see the whole picture front to back. Whereas the business can only see their particular silo. I think that gives us a better lens to look at what could hit us in the future. I think there is no single answer yet, but I think that is where the collaboration between the risk functions and the business needs to sit together and brainstorm and come up with the themes for the future. What we try and do, for instance, is we share with the CEO. We have a planning week annually, twice a year, and both the times the CEO comes with his exco to meet our exco, and then we share ideas and we say, look, we brainstormed and we have X, Y, Z themes, and believe it or not, for next year cybersecurity continues to be a theme. Data management continues to be a theme because we haven't worked it out yet, or the business haven't, and then we brainstorm accordingly to say, is this a surprise, or were you expecting something else? And I think till we work out a proper equation or a formula, I think, which is never going to happen. The collaboration, two brains are better than one, always gets us in a better position in front of regulators, with the press, and then we can try and add to make it 44 if we wanted. I think that is a starting point, I would argue.
Chris, 30 seconds, if you don't mind.
No, I just agree with everything he said. Okay.
Thank you. Sophie.
Well, I just wanted to say that looking forward is the second line of defense job, I would argue, and a risk committee should be spending a lot of this time doing just that. And one aspect in which is clearer is when you build and maintain your emerging risk register. Now, obviously, looking at cyber risk issues in particular does require very specialized skills that people will struggle to acquire at the right level. So it's not just through training, you also need to hire the right people to be in that room and have those conversations. But finally, it's also about a mindset where you think about the unthinkable, and your brainstorm has to be facilitated in a way where people are encouraged to think outside of the box, which is not easy in your day-to-day work environment, but there are techniques who help us, who can help us do that.
The last word.
So I completely agree with my partners here about the emerging risk, how important is the internal audit function and the role that we play on this aspect, because again, coming back, it's not because I'm in audit, but it's really true that we are probably the area that look at the processes from the end to end point of view. So we really see gaps and where the weaknesses are going to create an issue in the organizations. And with this specific aspect about cyber risk, we are always, every year, highlighting this and escalating as the trending topic and one of the three big threats for the organization every year. In this sense, and in this specific topic, we try to go ahead a little bit, and we are running some exercises within the internal audit function assimilated to the red teams. So we try to, because we've identified specific skill sets, we try to hack some of the softwares of the organization, and we escalate the findings directly to the board. So again, this is an example of how important is internal audit in this aspect of identifying emerging risks.
Thank you. I think it's evolution, really. Evolution of the safe. Safes are really good now in banks. Yeah. They've been evolution of over 200 years of designing safes. Cybersecurity is probably about 5 years old, really. So actually the education of bringing in the best of the best of the best to defend would probably be in addition to that. Because it's really hard to get into your safes. But it's really, you have, because of so many years of evolution, as you said. Shock horror, I've gone over time. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to personally thank you for your time and attention and some cracking questions. Sorry we didn't get a chance to ask more, although I'm sure these wonderful panelists will give up some time after this session to answer any questions. So could you please put your hands together for Chris, Sophie, Chandra and Ivan. Thank you.